feel very interesting subjects to talk about. I have a feeling, though, that most of what I'm going to share with you, you already know a lot of this, but I think it's good to have it reaffirmed, and hopefully there'll be some little nuances in what I share with you tonight that are kind of new to you and will sort of bolster your excitement to go out and share it with people. So anyway, we're going to talk about biogenesis first, and then we're going to talk about biodesign and biomimicry, and I'll explain what those are, and then bioweapons in nature. All four of these areas of interest or areas of evaluation basically counteract and conflict with Darwinian evolution, as opposed to microevolution, the adaptations. So you could actually start in front of biogenesis and go back to cosmology and how did everything get started in the first place. And if you stop and think about the way I tell people is, what happens when you see smoke blow? Does it tend to want to get together? Does it want to dissipate? Well, it wants to dissipate. Well, the same thing with hydrogen gas. There's no mechanism the scientists have been able to come up with that's convincing enough that would take hydrogen gas that wants to diffuse throughout the universe to come together and then get massive enough to collapse on itself enough, and the pressure would then begin a fission process of hydrogen being converted to helium, let alone what we're going to talk about tonight. So let's assume that that's happened somehow. Now you've got an Earth, okay? So did evolution occur? Darwinian evolution occur? So these four areas of discussion basically talk about that. And you've heard of the term showstopper? Okay, we use that term a lot at work, okay? We were in the design of satellites and those types of things. There were optical systems, there were infrared detectors, and if the infrared detectors couldn't be cooled enough, that was a showstopper. If you can get something that would cool those detectors cold enough so that they would be sensitive enough to see an infrared object 25,000 miles away, it was a showstopper. All four of these areas are showstoppers for Darwinian evolution, and that'll become more obvious as we go through these. But before we do that, I want to remind us of why we study this subject. The implications are really important. I think a lot of Christians don't fully understand this, especially those Christians, or those who call themselves Christians, and I don't doubt that many of them are, but who believe in some form of progressive creation or some form of theistic evolution, do not know what the stakes are. They just think that, okay, I can pretend or believe that Genesis account of creation is somewhat mythological or poetical, but then I can believe in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ for my salvation. But the package is one package. It goes together all the way from Genesis to Revelation. And that's what the purpose of this slide is to highlight, is that by attacking creation, evolution is really undermining two foundational doctrines of Christianity. The first being creation, that there's a creator, and the second is that that creator had people that he wanted to redeem for himself, and he came to this earth in the form of flesh and died for us, shed his blood, and then was raised again for our justification as proof that his sacrifice was sufficient, more than sufficient. And that these two things go together, because if he's not the creator, he can't be he can't be the redeemer. Okay, so several scripture passages there talk about this. Colossians 1:16 through 20, Revelation 4:9 through 11, and Revelation 5:9 through 14, all talk about God being both the creator and the savior. The two things are tied together. I like to use the term knit together. So if supernatural creation didn't occur, then Jesus is not the creator. He can't be the creator. Okay? And therefore, he's not qualified to be the redeemer. That's important. That's a key thing to remember. So the doctrines of creation and redemption are knit together. And if you want to be right on the doctrine of salvation, you better be right on the doctrine of creation as well. That both of those things that you believe are biblical. So by understanding the importance of this issue, I think that Christians better equipped to evangelize as well. I think there's a lot of young people, especially, who go to school, they hear one thing in school, they come to church or they come to their home and say, well, you guys are telling me that God created all these things, but I have a teacher that's explaining these things away and seems to be giving me a better explanation than you seem to be giving. We need to be ready as parents and educators, Sunday school teachers, pastors, to give them an answer that we believe is biblical and that we're firm on, so that we are able to give them a firm answer as well. So Darwinism and creationism are totally incompatible. They're mutually exclusive scientific explanations of origins, and they're completely incompatible, meaning there can't be any such thing as a compromise viewpoint like progressive creation or any kind of theistic evolution, for that matter. Now, what's interesting, and this slide has really surprised a lot of people when I've shown it, because this is a quote. There are non-believers, atheists, that understand what I just said more than some Christians do. And here's an example. Quote, if all animals and man evolved, then there were no first parents. In other words, that's a myth. The story in Genesis is a myth. It's poetical. It's not really absolute truth. So if all animals and man evolved as Darwinian evolution would propose for us, then there were really no first parents. They weren't really real. There was no paradise. There was no fall. And if there had been no fall, then the entire historic fabric of Christianity, the story of the first sin, and the reason for the atonement collapses like a house of cards. This is an atheist saying this. Well, who was this atheist? It was H.G. Wells, and he wrote this in the Outlines of History. He understood this, and we need to understand it too. And we need to be prepared to give an answer. So, here we go. Darwinism or Darwinian evolution conflicts with the scientific facts. Science affirms a creator. Okay? Science affirms a design, therefore it implies a creator. We've had many discussions, I know, in this group about natural selection, comparative biology, microevolution, variation within species, which is an agreement with the kinds defined in Genesis, and biochemistry, where there's no evidence of molecular or cellular evolution. In other words, spontaneous generation, which is what we're going to talk about when we talk about biogenesis. Biogenesis is really a term that means that biology comes from pre-existing life. Life comes from life. It doesn't come from non-life. It's not a biogenesis. Spontaneous generation, which is saying that life can come from non-living things, is not scientifically feasible, and it's not scientifically shown. Biogenesis is the rule. And evolution will tell you that the exception to that rule must have happened at least once. Well, why did it have to happen at least once? That's hearsay. That's basically what you're saying, but you really have no proof for that. So Darwin recognized two major weaknesses in his theory, but discounted any evidence, and that's sort of what Mark was talking about in his introduction. Darwin made two startling statements in his book, Origin of Species. And the first one was, he says, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. But then he adds, but I can find no such case. What's ironic about this statement is that in his book, Origin of Species, Darwin makes a big point about the human eye. And he talks in his book about the fact that he is at a loss to explain how his theory, through many numerous successive slight modifications, could have produced the human eye. He admits that in his book. But it doesn't cause him to change his viewpoint at all. Okay? So the human eye would be an example right there of what he's talking about. And he admits that in his book, but then he says, he doesn't take it any further. He just sort of ignores that as evidence against his theory. The second statement that Darwin makes in his book is, if it could be proved that any part of the structure of one species had been formed for the exclusive good of another species, it would annihilate my theory. And that's the word he uses, annihilate. It would annihilate his theory. For such could not have been produced through natural selection. which, by the way, there's a little footnote on natural selection. Darwin had 6 editions of his book, Origin of Species by the Means of Natural Selection. There were 6 editions of this. The last edition that was published in 1879, I believe, Darwin makes another startling statement in this book. And what's interesting is I went on Amazon. You can buy copies of Darwin's book, but it's the first edition. They don't, as far as I can tell, they don't sell the 6th edition. And I'm thinking, well, it's not surprising that they don't sell the 6th edition. Why? Because in the 6th edition, Darwin had many people that were sort of supporting him, but also challenging him to explain how natural selection could produce the changes that you need. Because if I just look at this intuitively, and most people would look at it intuitively, how do you get new features, new functions into the DNA that would produce a new modified body part, function, or creature? They had even some of the supporters that liked the idea came up with these challenges to go through. Well, finally, I guess he broke down to the point where he himself realized that this couldn't be the case. And he admits in the 6th edition, he says it right there, black and white, that natural selection is not a means of a mechanism for this theory to work. He admits that natural selection does not work. And that's the whole foundation. That's what you hear on all these nature programs and these biology shows. Natural selection did this, natural selection. And yet Darwin in the 6th edition says, natural selection, guys, it's what we understand as creationists about natural selection. He came to that conclusion and wrote about that in his 6th edition, that it can't be used as a mechanism. So, but here at this point, this is from his 1st edition, he says he knows that this could not have been done through natural selection. So Darwin's honest enough to realize that if you have 2 entirely different species, whether it's a plant and a plant, or a plant and an animal, or an animal and an animal, that are mutually dependent on one another, they could not have evolved separately, because it's already so difficult just to have one thing evolve by itself and be productive and be functional, let alone something else, presumably evolving on its own separately through random process, that somehow at the very end of all this evolutionary process, they come together and they're mutually beneficial. He recognized that. Darwin wasn't a dummy. He recognized this and he wrote about it, but he adds, although many statements can be found in works of natural history to this effect, I cannot even find one which seems to be of any weight. Well, he didn't really look very hard, and he wasn't, I don't think, very honest with the evidence. These relationships, we call them symbiotic relationships, and they're all over the place. And Mark alluded to that again in his introduction. It occurs frequently. So, but are there such examples? Darwin said he can't find any such cases, and he says, I can't really seem to find any that hold any weight. But are there any such cases, and are there any that hold weight? And yes, and I don't think Darwin looked very hard. So we're going to look at biogenesis. Biogenesis, the law of biogenesis, that life begets life, life comes from life, invalidates Darwinian evolution. So what's interesting about this is spontaneous generation, or abiogenesis, in other words, without life coming from previous non-life, okay, abiogenesis, without biology genesis, is the same as spontaneous generation, was actually promoted a long time ago. It's not anything new. And when you look at this, you realize that just as there's one author of truth, God, there's one author of lies, Satan. And he's worked in men's hearts and minds who have wanted to reject God's truth for thousands of years. So here's an ancient philosopher, Anaximander of Miletus in 550 BC, taught that the first life, or that life was first generated by materialistic processes from sea slime. Does that sound familiar? This was 550 BC.